Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Healing and Freedom Journey. This is your brother from another mother, Mark DeJesus, bringing you insights along this journey. I'm all about mental, emotional, and relationship health, and if you are too, then you've come to a great place. I am continuing on a series that is near and dear to my heart. It has helped bring so much transformation, reformation, reconstruction, rebuilding, reforming, all kinds of great stuff in my life and my journey, and it has to do with the subject of grace. And this is going to be part 5 in a series that I've been doing and will continue to do to lay down some important understandings for our life and our journey, because when we understand the power of grace, it changes things. It's one of those areas when you experience grace, it really transforms a lot of ways in how you do life and how you think, how you see things. It really impacts how we relate. So today, what I want to get into is I want to talk about how grace transforms how we do relationships, how we approach relationships. And the premise that's overarching this broadcast is when grace impacts your life, people around you get to experience the blessing of it because of what you are experiencing, learning, and practicing in your own life. Now, as I mentioned, grace as a working definition for this series, God's relational empowerment, divinely working in and through your heart. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about the through your heart, meaning towards other people. I'll get into aspects of ministry and gifting and calling in future broadcasts, but today it's simply about how we relate to people. Going back to the definition, in and through your heart as a gift based on the work of Jesus Christ. So with that in mind, one of the things that we really need to connect to is that as we're learning to experience more and more of the grace of Jesus Christ, we also realize, wow, this shifts and changes my perspective on other people, how I relate to other people. And I believe when grace impacts your life, one of the first areas that it needs to impact and should impact is the people around you, whether it be believers that you talk to and interact with and communicate with, non-believers and how you deal with them. That grace has a massive impact on the overall perspective. In fact, when I watch people experience change in their relationships, somewhere in there, grace has had a major impact. And you can see how much someone has been impacted by grace, not necessarily how they teach, although that's one aspect, or how they might express or teach the Bible, certainly. But it really comes down to how they relate to people in real life, because that's where grace is wanting to have an impact. It's how we relate to each other in real life, because I see it over and over again scripturally and in my own life, that grace really transforms how you conduct relationships. And so there's some things I want to share with you to exhort you. Then I want to give you some scriptures and give this some application to enhance your life. My goal today is to enhance your journey, to see improvement and just things in your life, just growing in quality in what's manifesting. Let me first say that when you grow in grace, it teaches you to manifest God's heart for people. I find in my journey, my desire is that in every situation in relationships, that I would carry God's heart. Now, do I have the perfect mind of God in every situation? No, but my longing is, God, help me to have your heart, because many times we default to judgment, condemnation, or what we think that person needs, or what we think that person needs to hear. And I think all of us need to have a strong dose of humility to say, God, you know what this person needs. I submit myself to you as a vessel, but I want to connect to your heart for this person. Because when you connect to your heart, you're connecting to love, you're connecting to compassion, mercy, forgiveness, grace. Now you're set up to see that person in a more fruitful light. It's easy to condemn and judge or just dismiss someone, yell at them, or point out all the things that I'll point out all their sins and struggles and what they're doing wrong. It's easy to do that. It's harder work to dig deeper and seeing God's heart for the person, his compassion, and what he's up to in their life. So when you live from grace, you see things from a relationship standpoint. Many people interact through rules standpoint. Here are the rules, here's the things, and that becomes the primary thing. Or many Christians relate from a sin standpoint. They're looking out for sins. They're looking out, and they got to call it out, and they become compulsive about it. Whereas grace doesn't ignore sin. Grace doesn't make light of sin. Grace is actually sober about sin. But it allows us to see people from a place of humility and yet retaining a sense of compassion and kindness throughout. Meanwhile, you're learning more and more about how God sees us. Jesus Christ himself, the Word became flesh and he dwelt among us. We call that the incarnation, incarnate work, where he walked amongst us. God showed himself to us. He came down to us instead of us trying to climb the stairways to heaven to try to get to him. And I believe that this is a big part of what God is doing amongst us, that we learn how to meet people and how to interact with them in the way that Jesus manifested grace, because out of that grace, it was relationship oriented, and it was God's heart for the situation. And so when you watch Jesus, you see the heart of the Father. In fact, if you want to understand and learn and grow in the Father's heart for you and for other people, watch how Jesus acts, because you could watch him and say, that's how Abba thinks. That's how Dad thinks. That's how our Heavenly Father thinks. And so when you want to grow in grace, it teaches you, God, I want your heart. I want the heart that you have in how you're seeing someone in their journey. This is going to lead you into grace, compassion, mercy in much more fruitful ways. Another thing I want to address is all life change occurs within powerful relationship interactions. We're all learning on how to relate to God, ourselves, and other people in more fruitful ways. Now, I'm here to say that all healing happens in relationship. Now, all brokenness happens in relationship. In fact, our mental health erodes because of relationship breakdown. Our minds and our emotions come under the impact of relationship breakdown. And grace creates an atmosphere by which we see we're all broken, we're all messes, and we're all learning to be loved by God and walk in the truth that sets us free. It levels the playing field, and it helps us to stop competing and stop fussing in how we're relating to each other. Instead, learn to see the value in what each person brings. And so my life is enhanced by being around you, and your life is enhanced by being around me. Our mental health is improved by being around grace-based people, because grace-based people have a power to them, but they're relationally wired in such a way that enhances intimacy, enhances connection. It's great stuff, isn't it? And so I want to emphasize that enough. If you want to experience greater mental health, the journey is relationship with God, yourself, other people, and grace is a big part of that. What grace does is it humbles us. And I specifically want to talk about it humbles us in how we view other people's sins, mistakes, weaknesses, failures, and mistakes. Now, I have found that when you see yourself out of more and more grace, it needs to impact how you see other people. So many times we're harsh on other people because we're harsh on ourselves. Many times we also ignore ourselves while trying to be kind and gracious to other people. And many of you are realizing, yeah, I might be kind to other people, but I'm so hard on myself. And grace is changing the view. But what it does is it humbles us. And we live in a culture and a society that's, whether it's in the church or out of the church, that we don't know how to deal with other people's flaws, their mistakes, their falling, their battlegrounds. We are lacking grace, and it makes us very, to use this term, unsafe in how we handle these very delicate and vulnerable issues. You see, when we hear of someone else's struggle, what we really want to do is we want to be in a sober place. We don't want to act like we're better or act like we know more. We want to remain sober, because sobriety doesn't deny something. It also doesn't drown in something. When I'm walking in grace, it teaches me to lean on mercy instead of jumping to judgment. Because we typically jump to judgment, right? You hear about somebody's marriage or somebody who has a problem or something gets exposed, right? We often jump to judgment. That's the easy way to go. It's challenging. It takes more growth to dive into mercy, because mercy keeps us sober and less judgmental, because we realize I could end up in that same situation myself. Who am I to say anything that makes me look like I'm better or higher? I could easily be in that same situation. That's sobriety. And when you're in grace, you feel protective of people's hearts. You feel protective over their situation, that in these vulnerable times and seasons when things come up, that God, be merciful to us and thank you for your mercy. May we be merciful to each other so truth can arrive and actual healing. Because when we're gracious, it gives room for healing. When grace isn't there, there's no room to heal. The judgment comes down, the sentence comes down, punishment happens. There's no restoration. There's no healing. You're left abandoned is what happens. But when you're filled with grace, you are now set up to more and more be a help to people in their struggle. Because you're not so easily taken aback by, certain battles or certain sins. And that's something that has been a part of a journey of my wife and I. We found that we were willing to roll up our sleeves with very difficult battles and struggles. And people feel very safe. And even in the early days of our ministry work, when I didn't have an office and people would just come over to my house and I'd work with them and help them. We had a problem that would arise, a good problem. They didn't want to leave because they often felt connected to the understanding and the peace and the grace that was available to them. And it's something that I want to impart and encourage to all of you. You become people that when others share, man, they feel understood. They feel connected in relationship in the midst of their struggle. Because relationship connection is going to bring about an awareness of truth. And truth that is the truth of Jesus Christ sets us free. Because so many of us have been bound by constant accusation and condemnation. What a relief to enter into grace. And now we can actually deal with the problem. Now we can actually work on it versus trying to fight off all the shame attacks that we're finding ourselves underneath. And so it's very humbling when you experience grace. It humbles you in how you talk about other people. And many of us can get very judgmental, and we need a humbling interaction with, I could be in the same boat. I find that grace also makes us less compulsive about trying to quote unquote fix people. Now, because of our performance-driven, perfectionistic, which is really just law-based, performance and perfectionism is really the modern-day expression of law-influenced thinking and living. It can be so easy to see people through the lens of what's wrong with them. But you know what grace does? Grace actually points you to what God is doing. It's easy, like I said, to go to judge and find what's wrong with someone. When you gain God's heart for somebody, now you actually are looking for, what is God up to? What's he saying over this person's life? When I'm more rooted in grace, it's less about trying to fix people and more about just being a support and a help and just uplifting what I sense God is doing in a person's life. Many times we just want to just fix somebody, give them a quick prayer or a quick thing, or just do this or just do that. And when you get into grace, though, it's more, how can I have a relational mindset for where this person's at and what they're going through, which then often leads us to praying for people more versus just fussing over them. It makes us less compulsive about confronting all these things. Many Christians can be constant confronters. There's always calling out and pointing out the thing. The church lady comes out very easily in people where they feel it's their right and they got to tell you, these things that they got to set you straight. And When grace has a deeper impact in your life, grace is not afraid of confrontation, by the way, but grace knows how to cultivate an environment of humility and compassion. And in that, we're now more patient with God's timing. We're allowing the Holy Spirit to work, and we wait on God's timing. We bring things in appropriate timing versus just compulsively rattling it off because we feel some kind of agitation or some kind of, disturbed emotion that we're chasing after. I find Christians can be very compulsive about trying to call out stuff in other people and confronting things. And it's actually obsessive compulsive behavior that needs that compulsion needs to be delayed. We pray for the people. God, give me a heart for this person and help me to be mindful. We walk slow because grace teaches us to slow down and take a journey pace, right? This is a lot different than what we often see in people's lives, right? When you operate in grace, you're less argumentative, less about like debating and winning debates, and less heady about arguing back and forth about all these things. It's more about humility and meekness. When you operate in grace, you actually put out the fire of strife. When you don't, you contribute to strife when you're not living in grace. Grace says, I want to meet you where you're at. I found in the early days of ministry, I was very argumentative, very prone to debate, defending myself, being right, making sure I was right. It was a self-protective mechanism of how I felt safe. If I was right, or if I won the argument, if I said the thing that I felt needed to be said, and didn't matter how I said it, didn't matter if I was compulsive about doing it, I felt like, yeah, that's the right way to live. And I found that the more I've learned grace, the more it's humbled my heart, and I don't value arguing anymore. Whereas I would jump in, roll up my sleeves, and it would just add strife. I'd see nothing come out of it. I've learned why Paul said, stay out of that strife. It doesn't produce anything good. Because Paul taught his spiritual son, like Timothy, to stay out of those quarrels. Just remain humble and meek. And he even taught Timothy, in meekness instruct people that are in opposition. Just be meek and humble and share. And they may not be willing, and they may be filled with strife, and some may even be divisive, and you have to deal with that when they're not willing to hear, and they may reject it. But I find that grace relationally makes you more reasonable with people. Like, hey, I'm willing to hear you out. I'm willing to talk this out. I'm willing to have a conversation. I feel that reasonability is something God carries. He says in Isaiah, come now, let us reason together. Though your sins are as scarlet, they shall be made as white as snow. And I think it's interesting how God, in Old Testament, in the presence of sin and disobedience, he says, let's reason together. And so if he can do that, and we are his children, then we can manifest that. We can be reasonable and hear each other out and be quick to listen, slow to speak, and therefore slow to wrath. Unfortunately, strife chases around our families, our relationships, and the need to be right and to win an argument owns the stage. So we feel like we got to get our point in. And I've found as grace has a work in my life, I'm less defensive about myself, less argumentative about what I teach and talk about. I'm not saying I've arrived. I'm just saying I've seen the fruit, and it's a relief. Because I don't find myself under the pressure of that as much anymore. I'm letting it go more and more and more because it's learning about humility and meekness and just carrying God's heart, not getting caught up in all the self-defensive arguments and strife that's out there. When you live in grace, you're looking more for the heart of the matter. And what's happening in someone's heart and life? You don't just look at a symptom. You start to realize why people do what they do. You see a sin pattern in someone's life, you understand, what's fueling this? What's giving so much room for this person in this area? And it even leads you to understand why people don't do what they want to do, right? Sounds a bit like what Paul said in Romans 7, right? Where he said, man, this thing I want to do, I'm not doing it. And this thing I don't want to do, I am doing it. And one of the conclusions that brought him freedom was out of Romans 7 was Romans 8, verse 1. There is therefore now no condemnation. And condemnation is the enemy to grace. And condemnation wants to block us from living in grace and keep us in a law-based perspective in how we deal with ourselves and other people. And so when you walk in grace, you're going to look, I want to understand the heart of what's going on here. You're also going to long for, and grace people long for having real, authentic relationships. And they want to work on how to relate more effectively. It's like, I want to love you, and I want to work on what doesn't want to love you. In me, I want to work on areas of my life that struggle with love or being loved or working through love. I want to work on those areas. And I want to be more effective in that. I learn how to follow the ways of God, to manifest the ways of Christ through how I interact with you. That's the practice. That's the place. Christ likeness isn't just how much you read your Bible and pray. Don't get me wrong, those are important. But I think a lot of times we think that our growth is just us and God in the closet, just talking to him. And really, no, it's also me and you and how I interact with you and how you interact with me. That is actually where discipleship happens. It's in the practice. It's in the lifestyle. We often make it heady Bible studies. That's where discipleship is. And it's actually learning how to relate. God, may I manifest the fruit of the Spirit. Because when you walk in grace, it teaches you to become an emotionally safe person. I know that term gets thrown around a lot, and sometimes it gets overused. But I think it's when you understand emotional safety, grace brings that. Because it brings, safety is about having an environment where somebody can work through what they're feeling, what they're struggling with. And when someone does not operate from a place of grace, these become not only unsafe, they can become dangerous people. In fact, in people's lives, some of the greatest damage that has been done is not necessarily relational breakups, hurts, trauma, drama, and all that, which that's awful, really painful stuff. It's been on top of that, the condemning, shaming, very legalistic, law-based ways that people are approached. And unfortunately, it's caused so much damage. And it's actually at times been very abusive, where people now carry that. You see, if you have a struggle, you don't want to go to a non-grace person. I even find in my life, if I'm interacting with somebody and I pick up on their non-grace ways, meaning you see a pattern of how they talk about other people. I'm going to get into that in just a moment. You can find out a lot about someone and how they talk about other people. And you see that accusation, you see that judgmentalism. There's an aspect when I see that, I go, yeah, you're not coming over to my house. Because you're going to walk in my living room, you're going to judge this, you're going to judge the carpet, judge the lights, look what they have, or look what they don't have, or look at this, or this is what I would do. People that have very judgy eyes and very accusatory eyes, and you can see that in how they talk about other people. They're unsafe for kingdom effectiveness. And the most unsafe people in the Bible were the Pharisees. And how they presented themselves, how they shamed others, and put a burden and demand on the people that they themselves didn't even carry. It was the group that Jesus was the hardest on because he had to be very confrontational with the work they do to damage people's receptivity of the grace of God. And so this is important that we all learn to sober ourselves so we let grace teach us how to become emotionally safe people. Because what does grace do? Grace enhances how we do relationships. Now, I want to take a moment to look at something that Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. We see him speaking about the grace of God and how grace manifests. I find this very interesting in how he's relating to the church and how he's communicating here. He says, for our boasting, 2 Corinthians 1:12, our boasting is this. It's like, okay, what's he bragging about here? His boasting, right? The testimony of our conscience. I'm going to do a video soon on the subject of conscience. What is the conscience? What does that look like? The sense of integrity that you live by and the sense of right or wrong that you live by. is this. He says, conducted ourselves in the world in two things: simplicity and godly sincerity. Really interesting there, because those are usually not things that we boast about. Life being simple. Life gets very complicated and full. And he talked about simplicity and sincerity. We keep it two S's here, man. Keep it simple, keep it sincere. That'd be a powerful ministry life, a powerful difference you make in others if you just live simple and just be sincere. Be simple, just have sincerity, not with fleshly wisdom. In other words, what the world system of knowledge and like stacking up a bunch of like, like in our modern phraseology, it's a lot of the self-help things and things. There's good stuff there, but it becomes like man-centered. Here's the way that we make things better and make ourselves better. And it's not wrong if you listen to those things or take an input. But at the end of the day, that kind of wisdom only goes so far. The grace of God leads you to something so much more divine, because in the world's wisdom, you're trying to play to your strengths and work those strengths and hide your weaknesses, right? And you have an image that you want to portray. In grace, you see it all. And Paul is saying here, he says, but not in fleshly wisdom, but the grace of God and more abundantly towards you. He's like, I'm going to keep this simple and sincere. That word simplicity, it means singleness, simplicity, sincerity, mental honesty. And when you look it up in the Strong's definition, the virtue of one who is free from pretense. Right? What's pretense? It's an attempt to make something that is not the case appear to be true. Make yourself appear to be something that you're not. And you're not manifesting hypocrisy. There's a simpleness of here's who I am, here's where I'm going in my journey. And sincerity. What does that word sincerity means? Purity. It can mean, I had to look this word up. Ingenuousness. Ingenuousness. I'm sure some of you can pronounce that better than me. But that word's interesting. In English, it means showing innocent or childlike simplicity and straightforwardness. Like just childlike innocence of talking, that just keep it simple and sincere. I'm just being myself, not trying to be something I'm not, and I'm keeping things simple. This deserves a Selah. It deserves something that we don't necessarily teach, but need to practice and ponder in. When was the last time you met a Christian leader who manifests, when you walked away and said, man, they were sincere and simple in how they shared, and just honesty? When people operate in that, it's refreshing though. People are drawn to it. You're drawn by this sense of like, wow, that person was real. Not real in just the sense you just dump the truck out and just share everything in your life. That's not what being real is. It's just there's no pretense. I'm not trying to preserve an image. And we live in a world where people are fighting to preserve an image, to be something, rather than just being simple and sincere in their walk and in their journey. I look at that scripture and I go, wow, that's a great reminder, because that's where grace shows up. Grace shows up when you're just you, just honest about yourself. And simplicity is a beautiful word. It's something that's pushed up against in today's complicated, look nice and keep everything looking according to a certain image that we want to portray. Now, when it comes to the manifestation of grace in our relationship, this is where it really shows up. It shows up in our words. I find what grace does is grace does a refining work to our communication, our language, our words, and how we communicate. There's a great impact there. And isn't that how when we talk about relationships being enhanced, relationships being transformed, One of the primary ways is in our words. It's not just about the words that you're saying, it's how you're saying them. Because isn't that really what it's about? Two people could say the same thing, but how it's being said can make a difference, and grace makes the difference. So grace shows up in how we talk to people and how we talk about people. The first one is when we're in their presence. The second one is when we're not around them. The second one is where heavy judgment, condemnation, shame can really come in. Now, we could certainly do it in the first one. The second one, about people, is really where grace, let's be honest, can have a much, much deeper work in our life. Now, I'm going to say this as a bit of a disclaimer. I've had my battles in my OCD healing journey. I've had battles, and many of you have this battle. Many of you write to me, hyperventilating about your words. And I've had at times where this has tormented me. Now, all of my life, in ways that God has used me, he's used me through my words, my ability to communicate. And many people are blessed by the grace that's on my life in sharing things and explaining things in ways that are helpful, empowering, truth-filled, but yet seasoned with grace and have compassion and understanding. And it blesses people. But I've also had my wrestling match many, many times about, did I say the right thing? Did I come across the right way? Did I say this? Maybe that if I had said this differently, this would all happen differently. I've had many social situations where after I spun and spun and spun about something I said and how I came across. I've had many pastoral meetings where I've had to implement leadership and afterwards spun out. Did I say this? Maybe I should have done this. I've had many late nights spinning over people situations. And so I've had to learn in my healing journey to be kind to myself and gracious to myself. So I want you to understand that what I'm sharing with you here is not a legalistic tirade. It's not nitpicking over every little word you say. This is an invitation for us all to be enhanced, because there is no question when grace impacts your life, it impacts how we talk to people and how we talk about people. In fact, this is the number one area I look at. If there was a litmus test, there's a litmus test. It's just something that I keep my antenna out for, of how people talk to and about people, because this shows either the presence of grace or the absence of grace. And listen, you can talk about very difficult things in people's lives, but grace keeps you sober, because we're so quick to throw stones. We're so quick to say we're right, and while we shame other people and destroy other people, and we feel victorious. And many preachers operate in this. They operate in a non-gracious way, and in their condemning, yelling, screaming, shaming, they get some applause, they get some, yeah, we got them, but we didn't enhance anything. We as believers are called to enhance the world around us. It doesn't mean that we don't speak the truth. It doesn't mean that we ignore sin. Where sin abounds, grace abounds even more. We move into it with truth that sets people free, wrapped in compassion. It's a big change. It's a big difference from what a lot of us have been shown, which is more impatience and just a lot of beating people over the heads, law-based influence. I want to bring up this area of our words. In Ephesians 4:29, I want to bring some clarity, hopefully, that can help you in your journey. Paul says, "Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers." Now, for many of us, especially if you have obsessive tendencies or you beat yourself up really easily, or you can get really judgy towards yourself, we often read this passage of scripture, say, don't ever say anything, any bad word, just speak perfect things to build people up. Let's look at this a little bit little bit deeper. That word corrupt, it means rotten, corrupted, and no longer fit for use, worn out, of poor quality, bad or unfit for use, right? So we're seeing these words that they're just not useful. He says, don't let that come out of your mouth. But what is good for necessary edification? What does edification means? It speaks of building. It could speak of a building, right? Like an edifice, edification, building up, edifying, the act of building. We're enhancing or promoting the growth in someone else, adding wisdom, manifesting happiness, holiness, fruitfulness in someone's life, edification. So in one sense saying, don't let corrupt words come out of your mouth, but edifying words. So what are the corrupt words speaking of? Right? Because people are like, oh, I joked around with my friends. That's corrupt words. The corrupt words here are words that are worthless and of poor quality, and they tear down someone, which is very easy to do. A lot of preaching is justified in the sense of tearing people down. And they call that, I'm giving them the truth. You know, people just don't want to hear, they just don't want to hear it. I'm not preaching to itching ears, I'm preaching the truth, right? This is saying here that there's corrupt words that slice and dice people. And all that does is give more room for accuser, more room for condemnation. The edification is the building up. In other words, don't use your words as a way to just tear down. That's useless work. It's worthless. There's no value in that. Find a way to build up what God is doing by how you use your words. Now, in order to do that, you got to be a little more thoughtful, a little more patient, a little more self-aware, right? We have to take our time a bit. It takes work. It takes growth. The goal is I want to, by my words, that you feel you're being added to. This is what grace does. Remember, it adds empowerment. So to put it in a plain sentence, if I'm using words to edify, I'm looking for what God is doing and I'm calling it out. So I might be interacting with somebody who, I don't know, he's coming to do some work on my house or something like that. Or it might be a landscaper, or it might be, carpenter or whatever it is. Now I'm talking to the person and I sense the grace on them. We talk and exchange. They might go, oh yeah, I'm a believer, or maybe they're not. Might find a way. I don't force it. And I don't do this every time. So all the compulsives out there. But when grace shows up, hey, it might be like this. Hey, you seem to have a real sensitive and compassionate heart. People must really get a lot by being around you. I've said stuff like that. And you can see the encouragement. Or I may say, the quality of your work is really good and meaningful. I want you to know it's very, very meaningful to me. And some of them have paused and oh my goodness, we don't hear that. And we say, well, that's encouragement. I want to say something deeper. That's calling out grace. You see something that's at work in somebody's life, whether it's through their emotions, the way they talk, the way they live, or even what they do. You see the grace and call it out. I want to see what God's doing in someone's life and call it out and enhance it. Because grace always adds. The enemy's always taking away. Steal, kill, destroy, right? Somebody can be going through a really tough battle, and you can point out what they're doing wrong. And you could be right, but you're wrong. Because grace notices what is wrong, but looks deeper to see what God is doing, because greater is He. You know, the devil is not greater than God. Sin is not greater than God. So we're going to look for what God's doing because he's going to overthrow what sin and Satan's kingdom is doing. But we have to learn to see, and this is also operating out of faith. We're now seeing people from a place of what God is doing, what people are moving towards. It's easy to focus on the limitations we see. Oh, that person will never make it, or that person will never. Or we just look at the exterior. That's why the Bible said, don't just look at people according to the flesh, or what you see in the appearance. Or to use Old Testament, man looks on the outward appearance, the Lord looks on the heart. Right? When you're looking for heart, you're looking at words, you're looking at countenance. And even when you see someone who's irritable and grumpy, I saw a guy, speaking of workers, it was a worker that was working on our air conditioning unit. And when I first saw him, I go, whew, that guy's gotten into some fights, and just looked at, and when I got close to him and I had a glance at his eyes, I saw the gentleness in his eyes. And some people could say, "Oh, Marcus, because you're an empath and you feel people's feelings." Sure, I get that. But when you live in grace, you often see things just more than just everyday interactions. I saw the softness there, the gentleness in this guy's heart. And see, in our moment in our days, be aware of grace moments where you could just even casually say something that could make a huge difference in somebody's life. Even going through a drive-through or just passing somebody, and you're saying something that's producing edification. What does Paul say here? You're imparting grace. Charismatics, they use the word impartation all the time. Baptists, some of them, they get a little uncomfortable with the word impart, But it's a biblical thing here that when you're around me, by hearing the words I'm saying, I'm imparting grace to you. Right? That if we all hear about somebody's marriage that falls apart and somebody goes, yeah, they had it coming to them, and they did this and they did that. And a grace person goes, yeah, we need to all just encourage our marriages, don't we? That's sober, right? Yeah. Let's guard and pray for our marriages. Let's encourage each other. We're looking for what God is doing, what God values, and we're adding to that. I'm imparting grace. I'm sending grace your way. That by me speaking, grace enhances your life. And by you being around me, you've been around who Christ is in me and the flavor that I bring, because each of us have a flavor to it. And let me get to this. I love this verse because it speaks of food and flavor, because I like food with flavor. Colossians 4:6 says this: let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt. I love this. What does salt do? Salt doesn't give flavor. Salt enhances the flavor that's already there. So when you're around people with your words, you're not trying to make something happen with your words. You're just bringing out the seasoning of somebody. You're seeing it and you're bringing out the flavor that they have. This is good. It's good. Anyways, back to what he's saying here. That your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. You know what helps me? Is when you carry grace and somebody asks a question, it's not, do you have the right answer? That's not what it is. It's not about having the right answer. It's more about letting grace lead you into wisdom, because grace leads us to wisdom. Because now we're not worldly wisdom would be like, I have the right answer and I know exactly what to say about this and I have all knowledge and wisdom. No. Part of wisdom is humility under God. And so when people ask, this is something that Jesus lived, and I like to pay attention to how Jesus responded to people, how he responded to situations. Because I find myself, and I know you are too, day in and day out, we have situations we're brought into. How do we respond? How do we respond? How do we respond? And it's not about responding perfectly either, because I got in that trap too. I got to say the right thing. I got to make sure the grace is in it. No, because part of grace is that I don't have to say this perfectly, but I'm sober and aware of God's work in my heart and my life. So I'm going to be gentle, compassionate, gracious, and merciful to you as best I know right now. I don't have all the answers. And in that, the wisdom of God shows up. And many times you can actually speak a sentence or a word that maybe actually be what somebody is needing to hear. We need less and less people that act like they have all the answers, and more just go, well, I don't know, but here's the thought that I have for you. Here's what God's helping me in. In fact, so much of what I do here is me sharing with you what God's done in my own life. Oh, that you all will be just amazing salt shakers. I ordain you as divine salt shakers. You just take that salt, just season everywhere that you go, you add seasoning. You go to somebody's birthday party, just add some salt. You go to somebody's barbecue, add some salt. You attend a church service, you go to a small group meeting, add some salt. Let your words enhance what's going on to bring out the flavor. And you go, how do I do that? Start with encouragement and look for what God is doing and call it out. I want to encourage my brothers and sisters. Look at what God is doing, call it out. Hey, I'm trying to remember an illustration of this came to my mind. I'm trying to remember the situation. Actually, I'm mixing a couple coaching sessions in my mind. There's been a few people where I tell them, I listen to them. It's such a delight to hear them taking something I've shared and then they're sharing it back to me even better than I did. It's like, wow, this is great. And I often will say, hey, I think you might be teaching this to people. You might be helping people in your own flavor and in your own way. What am I doing? I'm taking my salt shaker out and adding the seasoning, bringing the flavor of who this person is. Grace doesn't try to replicate who we are as a cookie cutter. I'm not looking at having a bunch of Mark DeJesus's, right? Now, if there's similarities, that's great. That's fine. There might be some threads, but I'm not talking about approaches or commonalities. I'm talking about personality. I'm talking about ways of that your character, your characteristics. I'm looking to take the grace that I have, impart it to you, so then it now has an impact in your life and now impacts other people in the flavor of who you are. Because I believe all of us in Christ have flavors. And some of you, it's Italian flavoring. It's some of you, it's got some Spanish and it's got some sazon in it, right? Some of you, it's got. I don't mean that literally. I'm talking about spiritually and emotionally, right? Although we could go literally. I'm getting kind of hungry as I'm sharing this, right? Where can that salt have its work? In your family, in your home. Spend time with your family. Seasoning them. As we sit at the dinner table, bring out the salt. Next time you grab a salt shaker, let it be a reminder to you. How can I add seasoning to the people I'm sitting with here? And it's usually done through just edification, as Paul said in Ephesians 4, using words to build up, because I want to add to somebody's journey. Man, I'm getting encouraged by this. Let me close with this one. We talk about our relationships being enhanced. A big part of it is our words. Colossians 3:16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, in all wisdom, teaching. And listen to this. This is the word of Christ. The word of Christ is taking place through the work of wisdom, through the work of teaching. But this is where the sweet spot is. Admonishing one another. Now, that word admonish is an interesting word. We don't really use that a lot in modern day language, but it has a bit of a corrective, like you're reproving, you're nudging somebody in a corrective direction, but it's done gently. It's nurturing. It's fatherly and motherly. It's brotherly and sisterly, right? How do you do this? Because we think of admonishing, we go to like correcting, right? And we go, hey, you shouldn't have done that. No, this is like, it's a gentle way of helping somebody to remember the grace that's on their life and encourage the flame of who they are. And he says you can actually do it through singing. Like, wait a second here. Admonishing. That's interesting. So I can bring, let's think about this. I can help strengthen the edifice of who you are, the structure of who you are. When I'm around you, let my words be edification, get my salt shaker out, and I'm going to sing when I'm around you. I do that a lot in my house. This is something that I do a lot, and my wife will nod and tell you yes. Sometimes to the family's annoyance, because I do get goofy with it. But I find that I've always got a song going. And sometimes I get a broken record going, and it's the same song over and over and over again. But I know the power of just having a song on your heart. And it says here that you be admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your heart to the Lord. When you're around somebody who just has a melody and they're just whether they have it verbally or they got it playing in their stereo, some people aren't that great as singers, but they got a good heart about it, and they let the stereo play. Modern technology helps us with this, right? What it does to the atmosphere, it points us back to grace. When you go to church and praise and worship happens, or you open your hymnals, whatever structure that happens, really at the end of it, there should be an enhancement of grace taking place, and we kind of get realigned within ourselves. I saw this over and over and over again in church, where we'd gather, but it'd be kind of, how you doing? Right? And it was like, okay, we need to apply some stuff this week. So you don't come every Sunday hungover from the battle that you've been fighting all week, right? But I'd notice when we begin to give thanks as a congregation, when we would then enter into song and we would express it, there was a significant shift that would take place in the room. What was happening? Grace was being welcomed. And it was actually teaching people. Not just the lyrics teaching, but the lyrics reminding us, because a lot of what we praise and say and sing to God is simply declaring who he is, reminding him of who he is, but really we're reminding ourselves. It's not like God forgot. We're reminding ourselves, and we're welcoming grace. So my application today is that you'd see people through an edifying way. What is God doing? How can I enhance it? Get your salt shaker out and keep a song flowing in your life, because the melody that is happening in you will add grace to people around you. We live in times where people are discouraged. Depression is all around us. It's not who has depression to some degree. It's like who doesn't. It's not who has anxiety to whatever degree. It's who doesn't. It's hitting a lot of people. Grace brings a shift into the atmosphere because it ushers in the work of Christ, points us to what he's doing, and that, as a focus, begins to overthrow the work of sin and what the enemy is doing in our lives, and what we often find ourselves focusing on, which is stealing, killing, eroding. I don't know about you, but I was encouraged. Even me sharing these words was bringing edification to myself. I pray that this broadcast did that. It added some seasoning to your life and to your journey. If it has, do me a favor, click the like button, click the subscribe button, share this with your friends, share this with someone that could benefit. Use it in your own ministry, in your own teaching, in your own sharing. Go to markdesus.com, subscribe to my newsletter where I update on a weekly basis. If you want to support these videos, which I provide on a weekly basis for free, you can support them by clicking on the donate button at markdejesus.com. You can also support these broadcasts on a monthly basis by making that donation a monthly donation. And we thank you so much for that. You can also jump into the Healing and Freedom community if you want to make a deeper investment in your life and your journey by having access to my course material in a deeper way and also community interaction. Now, this is your brother from another mother saying, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. I'll be back with some more insights on what grace is and how it can impact our lives. But in the meantime, I'm out.